How explosive was the recent Piers Morgan-Nick Fuentes interview? Actually, not very. One might have anticipated Morgan would blow up at Fuentes in this interview, as he has a history of doing with other controversial guests. But no, I was surprised that he actually handled it very carefully, acting as respectfully as possible, at least to begin with. And I know there are clips circulating around of times where Morgan broke away from that, but overall I think it was quite tame. Maybe he felt a burden of responsibility to handle it well, given the significance of Nick Fuentes and what he stands for. How much rests on the media treatment of influential people like Fuentes now? Maybe, maybe not. I initially had the perception that this was quite out of character for Piers Morgan, but then I looked back on some other interviews he's done in recent years and was reminded that he's actually adopted a calmer interview style in general since leaving ITV. He still blows up at some guests, but it's less frequent. It was back when he was a host on Good Morning Britain that he gave ferocious interviews, and quite frankly, was a worse broadcaster as a result, because I found that style of interviewing unwatchable. It was totally pointless, because you don't actually get any information from the guest when you just shout over them constantly. So this calmer interview approach was beneficial for the Nick Fuentes interview. It meant a proper discussion was had, where Morgan actually let Fuentes finish his points, and then respectfully dug deeper into his worldview, instead of constantly interrupting, shouting and browbeating like he's known for. Fuentes even called him out multiple times when he did slip into interrupting, and Morgan politely apologised, then let Fuentes continue. Even by Piers Morgan's calmer standards, this did seem quite out of character for him. It was weird to see him treading this carefully through an interview, particularly when it's with such a creepy weirdo as Nick Fuentes. Still, I'm glad Morgan employed this approach rather than bringing on a guest he clearly finds abhorrent just to shout at him constantly and inflate his own ego by acting like a hero taking on a villain. That would have been counterproductive because not only does it waste the audience's time, but I think it actually makes the audience identify more with the guest, and so they sympathise with them as a result. That's another reason why I never liked the extremely aggressive approach that was once standard for Morgan. I commend him for handling this interview more calmly. Although he certainly didn't give Fuentes an easy ride, Morgan did hold him to account and stood firm by his tough, sometimes provocative questions even when Fuentes accused him of bad faith. Morgan also got more combative as the interview progressed and wasn't shy about condemning Fuentes during it. But when you compare it to his interview with Tommy Robinson, for example, from years ago on Good Morning Britain, it's very different. Morgan just shouted over Robinson the whole time, and in this recent interview, Fuentes was saying far more controversial and egregious things than Robinson, yet still Morgan was civil. I think part of that comes down to a shift in culture. Morgan prefaced the interview by stating that Fuentes is becoming more mainstream, and he treated him as such. I suppose Morgan might be aware of the fact that since Fuentes has such a large following, shouting and trying to browbeat him is not going to achieve anything, and it's certainly not going to turn people away from Fuentes' message. In fact, it would just make him a martyr. Maybe Morgan's adopted this calmer approach generally because there's also the factor that when he was a TV host, he was more insulated from the effects of how he conducted interviews. Because he's independent now, he has to take measures to grow his audience and his business. So the way he talks to big guests in the political sphere requires more consideration than it once did. Before, on TV, he could just turn up to work, do his interviews, and maybe not give as much thought to what happened afterwards. Of course, there were still consequences to how he conducted himself on TV. He had the incentive to make the show he was on succeed for the sake of his career, and he did end up losing his job on Good Morning Britain for comments he made on air. But still, you get the point. There are different considerations for him now. Back when he was a Good Morning Britain host, there was a Tory MP boycott of the show, which I totally understood because going on there was an utter waste of time when Morgan just constantly hectored them and wouldn't let them speak. Because he's independent now, he has more of an imperative to conduct himself in a way that isn't going to deter other guests from coming on his show. But enough about Piers Morgan. How did Nick Fuentes perform? Did this interview reveal the appeal of him to those like me, not in his audience? To a certain degree, I suppose it did. When explaining his opinions on crime rates, you start to understand how he's probably attracted certain swathes of his audience by latching on to real problems people have concerns about, then pushing the rhetoric further to upsell those people on his more insidious ideas. When the intelligentsia and large segments of the political class don't seem interested in addressing high crime rates certain areas suffer, that leaves a gap in the conversation for Fuentes to fill. He perhaps provides people with an outlet for their frustration about the issue. Another quality that that probably lures fans in is the fact that even though Fuentes is kind of creepy, he's undeniably funny. He made me begrudgingly laugh a few times, and the fact that his humorous approach stood in contrast to Morgan's very serious, no jokes allowed about these sensitive issues approach made Fuentes seem even funnier by comparison. The dynamic between him and Morgan kind of had the character of a teacher telling off an irreverent schoolboy at times. Morgan as the teacher, obviously. Although, if anyone's deserving of that kind of admonishment, it's Nick Fuentes, and while the theatrics of this may count against Morgan here, I certainly agree with his sentiment in these exchanges, and not that of Fuentes. The fact that Fuentes is so openly outrageous is quite disarming, because not only is he funny by saying outrageous things, it's hard to take him seriously as a result, which may have this weird effect of making him seem like no real threat, even though his political project is awful. Fuentes' directness in this interview, and no doubt generally, in openly admitting to being racist is also kind of part of the package of his humorous performance, because it subverts your expectations about what a normal person would say when asked if they're racist. The fact that when asked he just bluntly says he is, catches you off guard and makes you laugh, even though what he's admitting to is obviously not good. And the fact that he's so willing to take on the label of racist probably unfortunately makes people admire him, because it shows a kind of strength. He's not willing to squirm and try to talk his way out of this kind of accusation, as almost anyone else would in his position. It's a bit like when Piers Morgan interrogated Lily Gaddis, who also proudly admitted to being racist. The fact that these people do that takes the power away from the interviewer, because that power is predicated on the ability to make the guest squirm, grovel, and try to protect their reputation. But Fuentes has built his reputation on being racist. That's where his power comes from, rather than it being an Achilles heel. So what's Morgan to do there? How can he rhetorically win? I'd say he does on most points to moderate people, but he's certainly not going to be able to deprogram any of Fuentes' fans. For that, you'd need someone with the intelligence and rhetorical skill of Jordan Peterson, who's adept at steelmanning someone's worldview to make them feel understood and acknowledged, then giving them the counter-argument, which is more persuasive as a result. Or someone with the stylistic sensibilities Groypers have, like Destiny, who can appeal to the internet edgelord crowd. I'm not sure deprogramming Groypers was Morgan's goal anyway, or if it was just to probe and debunk Fuentes as a journalist. By the way, while this interview may have revealed why people find Nick Fuentes appealing, it certainly didn't make him seem respectable. The things he was saying, while said humorously, were pretty awful, and there were moments that indicated it's not just bad theory he's adopted, but his character and behaviour beyond that aren't very admirable. So aside from being funny and stuff, there was nothing in this interview that made me think Fuentes had any meaningfully redeeming characteristics. While Piers Morgan did have a few ungraceful slip-ups during this conversation and did his Piers Morgan thing sometimes, I think you know what I mean, where he, either plays dumb or actually is dumb. You can't really tell which it is because, you know what I mean. The fact that he didn't seem to understand the crime statistic argument Nick Fuentes was making, which was a very simple concept. Morgan was bringing up school shooters, and shouldn't that mean you should fear and avoid all white people because most school shooters are white? And Fuentes brought up, the fact that that doesn't match the numbers of non-white petty crime, and so it's just a foolish argument really. And Piers Morgan, again, you can't tell if he's playing dumb or if he just actually doesn't understand the point that's being made. It's a very simple point, so I struggle to believe he's actually that stupid, but he clearly didn't want to grant Nick Fuentes a win there, and wasn't equipped to argue the point properly. So again, I don't know, either he was playing dumb or just is. But anyway, overall, he did conduct a pretty good interview, letting Fuentes explain himself while also probing and holding him to account. It was kind of refreshing to witness Piers Morgan employ this, for the most part, careful, more exacting approach to an interview, diverging from his past of just trying to bully guests. I think there's much more journalistic value in what he did here as a result. What do you think about that? Do you agree with the points I've made, or do you have a different perspective on this interview? Let me know in the comments, leave a like if you wouldn't mind, and subscribe for more videos like this on political and cultural topics. Bye!